no one wants to stand in the way of the politics. But this is the program here is part of the Japan Currents program series, which is a public affairs series that is sponsored by the National Association of Japan-America Societies with a grant from the Embassy of Japan in Washington, D.C. The interesting thing about the whole series is it's done on a competitive basis, so congratulations to the Japan Society of New York for winning this grant. Each of the societies who participates in this program chooses the theme that they want to emphasize based on local considerations and national considerations, the theme that they want to emphasize in the U.S. Japan relationship each year. So for example, if it's Houston, it's energy, right? And there are 11 of these programs going on throughout we're starting this is the first kickoff for this year. And between now and March of next year, there'll be 11 of these public affairs programs happening in the Japan-America societies around the country. So it's a nice way. Most of them this year will be in person. The last couple of years they've had to be virtual, but we're all so happy to be back in person and have in-person speakers from Japan. Nice to see you here, Mieko, and also from California with Jake coming. Joshua mentioned that there are 38 Japan-America societies around the country. The oldest was founded in Boston in 1904, and the most recent one, our member, was founded in 2015 in Iowa. So it really represents a whole series of private organizations that at the grassroots level, at the local level, support the U.S.-Japan relationship. And we're so pleased to have the our annual meeting here, as Joshua mentioned a few months ago, first time that many of the Japan-America Society folks from around the country had ever been to the Japan House. And they were inspired. They really were inspired by the thought of the long history of this Japan Society here, but the impact that you have, and also enthusiastic about the opportunity to work with the Japan Society on Japan-related programs. So I congratulate the Japan Society. In the 13 years that I've done the work at NAGIS, have been privileged to work with the society here with presidents from Dick Wood, whom I remember so well, Sakurai-san, and now Joshua leading the organization into the future. So thank you all for coming tonight, and congratulations to the Japan Society for winning the grant of the Japan Currents. We look forward to a very interesting talk that's just about to happen. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. All right, without further ado, let's jump right in. I don't think I need to do much of an introduction. You have their bios in front of you, but let me just briefly orient you to where we are. My left to right has nothing to do with their politics, I assure you. First, we have Glenn Nye. He's a president and CEO of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, and also a former member of the U.S. Congress from the great Commonwealth of Virginia that we both share. We have Mieko Nakabayashi sensei. She's a professor for the Center for International Education at Waseda University. She's a former member of Japan's House of Representatives in the Diet, and also a former Republican professional staff member as the Senate Committee on the Budget. So both sides there. And then last but certainly not least, Jacob Schlesinger. He's a fellow at Distinguished Careers Institute at Stanford University, and most well-known as a senior correspondent and longtime friend from Wall Street Journal. So welcome to each of you. Let's dive right in. Glenn, you're just coming in from D.C. We're still trying to understand what exactly happened last Tuesday. I was in Japan right before the elections. I was wearing this exact tie that happens to be all the U.S. president's signature. People thought it was Declaration of Independence. And I basically said, this is what I'm expecting, unfortunately, on Tuesday. And it doesn't seem that this tie color matches. It needs a little bit more purple in there, it seems like. It's not quite a red wave. So what did we just witness, and what does this mean more broadly from your point of view in D.C.?
All right, thank you for the invitation to be here. It's a pleasure to be at Japan Society with you, Walker-san, and to be part of this distinguished panel. So let me start with that. I want to start with just an observation about elections. Wave elections are sometimes harder to predict than they seem because they don't manifest until the very, very, very end of an election. And I'm saying this as somebody who ran for Congress in 2 wave cycles, one where I was on the wrong side of the wave and it was working against me, and one where I was on the right side of the wave and it was very much helping me. But in both those situations, it wasn't clear until Election Day how much of a wave there actually would be. So it's kind of hard to predict. But if you're going to try to predict based on things that have happened in the past, which is what we do in the prediction business and what pundits do, if you look at the data, if you look back now, and everybody's surprised that it wasn't more of a red wave, but if you look at the data and you ask yourself, was the data there supporting the case for the wave? It absolutely was there. So I want to talk just briefly about what happened and then what did we miss and what can we learn from this. So what do we know? We know data-wise that every time since the Truman administration, when a president's job rating was below 50%, that president's party lost an average of 43 seats in the House of Representatives. So that's a pretty big block. Democratic majority in the House was 5 seats, so they had a very, very small margin to work with. President Biden's approval rating was below 50%. It was somewhere in the mid to low 40s consistently as we're coming in to this election. What else did we note? 70% of Americans were saying the country is on the wrong track. 81% were saying they were dissatisfied with the economy. 55% disapproving of the job that President Biden is doing. Those are wave numbers, right? Those are screaming a dissatisfied public and a change election coming, particularly when the president's party is also the same as the control of the House and the Senate. You tend to get an even bigger effect. So that's what we were looking for, and yet you can't be quite sure what the wave will be because what the polls just show is that there's a lot of really close races. And they show that there's Republican momentum in many of them, but they don't show us that Republicans are winning all these close races by 10 points, right? They just show you that they're close and the momentum is on the red side of the column. So what happened? What happened? What we actually observed was this actually was more of a stability or status quo election. If you look at the results from last week, I should say the results from the past week and still counting. All of the incumbent senators that were running for re-election won. There's one more that's going into runoff in Georgia, so that one is still a question mark, but everybody where we know the outcome, it was status quo basically. If you look at Republican gains in the House, they look like they're set to gain somewhere around 10-ish seats. They were projected to get closer to 15 just from redistricting. So without having to go win any persuade voters of their case, just from redistricting alone, they should have gotten better than they did. So voters really kind of stuck with the parties in power in most places. How did we overcome all that economic bad news, and how did Democrats survive? I think the best analysis I saw for this was when so many races are so close, you have to look for these little marginal things, right? What made the difference? If you look at President Biden's disapproval number, 55% is very high. 10% of that was in the column of somewhat disapprove, and 45% was strongly disapprove. Everybody in the strongly disapprove column pretty much voted for Republicans, voted against the president's party, largely. But that 10% that were in the somewhat disapprove column actually broke 4% in favor of Democrats. Why? Well, what we learned from observing exit poll data was a couple of things. One was that abortion actually, the Dobbs Supreme Court decision actually turned out to be a pretty significant issue. A lot of, it was rated as the #2 issue after inflation or economic woes by people coming out of in exit polls. So that actually was an issue that raised Democratic turnout very high, above what you'd expect for a midterm election, and actually kind of matched Republican enthusiasm. And then there was also the question of the candidates and the election deniers, and it just appears that the fear of inflation was just slightly outdone by the fear of election denial in some of those races where it was very close already, and it was just that marginal difference. But it turned out across the board to result in basically kind of a status quo election. I want to make one observation about the economics because I've been kind of flummoxed by a lot of the economic data coming into this election. I was trying to figure out what is 81% of the country saying they're dissatisfied with the economy. What does that really mean? And it's an interesting economic time. So it's hard to kind of parse this economy because we have high inflation, which is disturbing and difficult for many people. Gas prices and food prices are up. but we have essentially structurally zero unemployment. So everybody that wants to work is working. And so one of my observations is I feel like people said they were dissatisfied with the economy, but they weren't existentially worried in the way that many people were when I was running for re-election in 2010, which was a red wave, and Democrats had been in power at that time, when there was very high unemployment, and people were really worried that the economy wasn't recovering quickly enough. So I think that the difference in economic patterns between this cycle and other cycles really made a big difference. Let me just talk about a couple of things that I'm looking for on the road ahead, and then I'll yield so others can make some opening comments. Senate majority is determined. The Democrats will hold a technical, at least, majority because they have the vice president to break ties. There are implications if the Democrats win the Georgia runoff on December 6th, and that is if you have a 51-seat real majority versus just a technical majority, then you get committee chairman. It's easier to get nominations and legislation through committees. Committee chairman then also gets subpoena power for hearings. So it does actually give the Democrats a bigger legislative advantage if they can get that 51st seat versus just having 50. But in any event, having 50 with the vice president gives you the ability to determine the legislative agenda in the Senate and prevent the other party from doing a lot of investigative hearings that might be uncomfortable. In the House, Republicans are essentially at majority, or will be tonight probably. They will have all the chairs. In the House, the committee that has the the party that has the majority essentially has almost unlimited power. But that power is dependent upon being able to corral 218 votes. If you can consistently do it, your party is very strong in the House. But it's hard when the majority is very small. And it will be very hard for Kevin McCarthy to keep that group together now with such a small Republican majority. And that is after he's got to win the speakership coming up. The vote will be the first day they swear in of the next Congress, which will be January 3rd. One thing I'm trying to see, I think he has a greater than 50% chance of getting the votes he needs for the speakership. One question, though, is can the sort of more extreme members of his caucus force a motion to vacate the chair, which is essentially a rule that allows them to pull back their votes anytime they want in the next 2 years. If they're able to negotiate that, it will mean a very unstable House leadership, very difficult time for Kevin McCarthy to maintain the speaker position, and he'll have to make a lot more deals. If he is able to negotiate away that and still get the speakership, you'll see a little bit more stability in the House. So let me stop there. There's a lot more to talk about, but I want to make sure my other colleagues have a chance to do their opening remarks.
Great. You put a lot of food for consideration out there that we want to get into. Nakabayashi Sensei, like, you've been on TV pretty much every day trying to explain to the Japanese public what the heck is going on when, as Glenn just pointed out, we don't actually know what's happening most of the time here, and even here in New York versus here in D.C. versus in Silicon Valley. Things do change. So I want to offer to have you give us a perspective from Tokyo in terms of what you think the reaction was. But I also I don't want to neglect the politics in Tokyo, because one of the things that's very easy to do is when you're dealing with such an exciting and interesting election like we have in America, sometimes the more mundane and methodical nature of Japanese politics to the outside eye seems very simple. But actually, when you go to Japan and you see some of the, from our perspective, very quaint scandals we see in Japan, they seem very different to what we're dealing with in America. So I want to also ask about the implications, if there are any, to what this might be. Because when I was there, I heard a lot about Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. And when things are tense in Washington and there's deadlock and gridlock, oftentimes that means buckle your seat. We're going to have a lot more visitors overseas. And Japan is a very interesting destination right now, having just reopened to tourists a couple weeks ago. So with a big wind-up, Nakabayashi Sensei, let me welcome you to Japan Society all the way from Japan.
Thank you so much. And I'm very excited to join you and this excellent panel. Again, I really appreciate your invitation. And it's such an exciting time to observe American midterm elections, and I listened to Mr. Nai's statement very carefully. because I need to explain this to the Japanese people over there. And I arrived New York yesterday, and I got like 5 interviews by TV programs, and even before this panel, I had to answer some questions about midterm elections. And right after today's session, I will be on TBS Hirobi on live to talk about, again, American midterm elections and politics. Japanese people are extremely interested in American politics this week and last, because this midterm election might affect American presidential election in 2024. Also, Mr. Trump announced his candidacy already, and that actually ignited more interest in Japan. And as some of you might know, Japan has actually 3 kinds of broadcasting. One, traditional wave on the air, also BS, some kind of digital and more focusing on policy issues and details, but you have to pay for that. And CS programs, that is similar to American cable TV networks. And those programs have more time to talk, but usually you have to be on the studio all the time. So I had to decline like 5 offers of BS and CS programs. That tells how great Japanese interest is in this midterm election. And last night actually, in the United States, former President Trump announced his candidacy. And lots of analysts over there in Japan are appearing on TV and also writing on newspapers and magazines, what kind of things could unfold after that. And after listening to Mr. Nai's statement, I felt pretty good because I have already finished my draft to put on Nikkei Shimbun's Keizai Kyoshitsu, that is a big column. And I already said that Republican would take over the House, but I was not sure when it is going to be determined. And the final manuscript had to be really changed if the number is not clear by Friday. So, but I felt really good. And what people are interested in would be who would take the leadership in the House, and what kind of things should be discussed. For example, what happens to the assistance and provision of the war in Ukraine, whether House Republicans would allow President Biden's initiative to provide so much money to Ukraine. And that comes to American budget process, and CR is going to be expired on the 16th of December. And the debt ceiling is going to expire next year in July of 2023. And Republicans may take advantage of it. That means shrinking American budget would be some sort of purpose of American next Congress. And what does it mean to Japan? If that happens, maybe American interest in international affairs could also shrink. And Japan might take greater role to keep the balance and peace in the Indo-Pacific region. That means maybe Japanese budget could be necessarily increased. However, as Dr. Walker just mentioned, Prime Minister Kishida is fighting so hard about his difficulty, regarding some scandals related to the unification charge. That is a long history of having such a relationship with LDP and some other politicians. Why it is such a big deal? Because Prime Minister Abe was killed. That was such a tragedy. And a tragedy for international relations and the stability in that region. But Prime Minister Kishida wanted to somehow simply succeed former Prime Minister Abe's position, but because of the unification charge scandals, he is having such a difficult time. His cabinet member, Mr. Yamagiwa, just resigned, and the second person also resigned. That was not because of unification charge, but his misspeaking about being Minister of Justice, and he was talking about capital punishment. He talked about it so lightly, and it became such a huge deal, and he had to step down. Therefore, Prime Minister Kishida is also suffering a very low support rate, which is around 40%, similar to President Biden. But Japanese political system is under parliamentary system, different from presidential system. Once Prime Minister's support rate gets lower, LDP, which is the current ruling party, hesitates to support the Prime Minister at some point. Therefore, he needs more support from his colleagues within the LDP. But if his handling gets poorer, then maybe there are some difficulties that awaits Prime Minister Kishida within the LDP. He might have to call a snap election to get people's approval somehow to lead the LDP and Komeito as ruling parties, ruling coalition. That kind of things are discussed among reporters and media people. Although it appears that even if he calls a snap election, he may lose lots of seats for LDP that may endanger his leadership position in the LDP. So it's going to be a huge dilemma for Prime Minister Kishida. But when he is abroad, there are some international summits for this week, such as G20, APEC, ASEAN meeting, and so on. He seems to be doing pretty well and trying to lead the international agenda and reiterate China's expansionism and so on and so forth. So it depends on how well Prime Minister Kishida would handle the unification charge thing. In my opinion, he should really take his position aligned to people's kind of feeling, people's emotion, because people is getting so much emotional about this issue. The charge, unification charge, is really destroying family ties and connections, and even these days NHK, maybe NHK people are here too, but they last night or so broadcasted a special investigative report about how children are adopted among unification charge members, and that might be a violation of Japanese law of adopting children. So things are really revealed every day. Therefore, he shouldn't wait too long. He should really hammer down these kind of problems even before that gets such a huge deal. Well, we'll see how Japanese politics will be changing, and Prime Minister Kishida would be doing for that. That is really affecting international, I think, coordination of such a difficult time that everybody is facing currently.
I really appreciate that, Nakabayashi Sensei, because I think this is like a perfect distillation from a DC and Tokyo perspective. And it's amazing how much you learn by kind of what people focus on. But one of the things I've been emphasizing since I arrived here is that the U.S. Japan relationship is actually much bigger than just DC and Tokyo.
Yes.
And it's important to consider, not just here in New York when people are getting things done and from a business point of view, because at least here in this country, the economic news tends to drive some of the larger agenda. And it seems like as DC's dysfunctionality and polarization and the entertainment of politics has gotten worse, we actually are looking for answers in other places. And one of those places we're looking to is actually Silicon Valley, where Jake is actually coming from. And as a longtime observer of this relationship, U.S. Japan, but also as an observer from the Wall Street Journal that has a pretty important editorial board and a way of framing.
Separate from the news.
Separate from the newsroom, yes, yes,
Make
yes.
that clear.
I want to get your perspectives and kind of bring you in on the kind of DC, Tokyo kind of perspective as we move into the larger perspective.
Thank you, Joshua, and thank you all for coming out tonight. It's an honor to be able to speak to you and be with this distinguished panel. You know, I was thinking actually you had started out by talking about your red tie and the purple tie there, and I was thinking my tie is the color of mud, which was maybe not intentional, but perhaps illustrative of where we're at. Those were both excellent table-setting comments, and I guess to try and supplement that, I thought what I would do is maybe pull the camera back a little bit and try and look at some of the bigger themes that are resonant right now. And I would say, if you look at sort of what is happening in America right now, of which the midterm elections are part of the context, but really only part of that context, there are a number of great debates that are whirling this country in ways that we haven't seen in a long time. One really is the nature of democracy, the question of whether we believe that our elections have integrity, whether we have faith in those elections, whether we have peaceful transfers of power. And another is America's role in the world, whether we continue to play a leadership role. And both of those have huge implications for the U.S.-Japan relationship and also for Japan. You know, America has long seen itself as the beacon of democracy globally. The Freedom House, which is seen as the arbiter of measuring the status of democracy, has talked about a democratic recession now, a global democratic recession for 10 years. And what's been disturbing the last few years is that while it was seen as the U.S. was pushing back against that, the U.S., I think, has now been consumed or threatened by that recession in global democracy. And then similarly, in terms of America's role in the world, whether America plays a leadership role or not, and how that both involves America's ability to defend Japan and an evolving partnership, which was really pioneered or expanded on by Prime Minister Abe to try and make Japan play a bigger role on all those things. So to delve into that a little bit more, I think that the midterms, as Glenn had sort of alluded to, but just to talk a little bit more about it, we're seen as, if not necessarily a victory for democracy, at least a sort of dodging with a bullet in terms of the threats that democracy has faced. I mean, first, just looking at the way that Election Day played out, there were a lot of fears, I think credible fears, that there would be violence on Election Day, that there would be intimidation by unofficial poll watchers, that there'd be a lot of confusion. And it's actually striking how peaceful and how smooth that Election Day went, with some notable exceptions like Maricopa County, Arizona, which could be problematic down the line. But overall, it was an incredibly smooth and peaceful day, which was inspiring in its own right. As Glenn had mentioned, I think everybody who ran in a position of power to control elections, who had run on a ticket of saying that they were likely to try and dismiss election results if they didn't like the outcome, lost. And what's interesting is, you know, while a lot of people are focused on the control of Congress, there was an unusual amount of attention in this election to people who run the nuts and bolts of elections in states, the secretaries of state, the attorneys general. And what's particularly interesting is that in some of those states where people ran on a platform of saying they were going to disregard election rules, those candidates polled lower than other people in their party. So, for example, in Nevada, a Republican won the governorship there, but the Secretary of State candidate who was running on a kind of election denialist platform lost. And so in that way, I think it played a bigger role perhaps than in any election that we've had. And as I say, you know, there are a lot of fragilities that have been exposed in American democracy over the last few years, and one election, as Glenn pointed out, a very, very close election, doesn't dismiss those overnight. but it does sort of indicate that there's been perhaps a little bit of a turning point. In terms of America's role in the world, again, that wasn't necessarily on the ballot, but President Biden tried to frame this election very much as putting what was going on in the U.S. in terms of democracy as part of a global fight between sort of autocracies and democracies. And Japan obviously is a very important and leading player in that. I don't know how many voters really went to the polls with Ukraine on their mind, but it is interesting that within the Republican Party and the people who were running for office, there were a number of people who expressed great skepticism about providing aid to Ukraine. Kevin McCarthy, who is likely to be the next speaker, made a point of saying during the elections that there's no more blank check for Ukraine. And a number of members of Congress, Republican members of Congress, have voted against the latest aid packages. And again, just as a bit of a template as to whether America is going to go full forward or pull back, that's another roiling debate that's going on. The other thing I would say, and I say this partly even though it's America-centric, but since Mieko said that Trump was such an issue of fascination in Japan, that I would say that Donald Trump, despite all the reports that he's been wounded, is not going away, and I think in some ways remains and will be perhaps if not the dominant force in American politics. One of the things that's striking in the exit polls that were taken and what made this election so unusual is that they actually asked, was your vote shaped by, one of the questions was your vote shaped by approval or disapproval of President Biden? Was your vote shaped by approval or disapproval of former President Trump? And something like 35% of the voters said that their feelings about President Trump were one of the most important issues that were on their minds going into the polls, which, when you think about it, is remarkable, if not unprecedented, that a former president who lost his re-election bid 2 years ago is still an important enough factor that he's shaping people's views as they vote. As Mieko mentioned, he's announced his plans to run again in 2024, but beyond that, he'll continue to be in the news for other reasons, one of which being, there's a lot of speculation that he will actually be indicted sometime between now and the end of the year for his actions on January 6th. Both Twitter and Facebook will face important decisions coming up. Facebook, I think, has a January deadline as to whether they will put him back on social media. I think if he does get back on social media, that obviously gives him a much bigger voice. And he will be central to what's going on in the Republican Party, even if people are trying to shun him, which is, and I think another big theme to look forward to right now in politics, or we're looking ahead in politics, not necessarily looking forward to it, but looking ahead to it, is that the Republican Party is likely to go through a major civil war right now. People say that Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, who's very popular, is now the fair-haired boy and the likely next nominee, and it's possible that he will be, but he's not going to get there without getting into a brutal fight with former President Trump. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out and how much that affects him. As Glenn mentioned, Kevin McCarthy is not guaranteed the speakership. He doesn't have a lot of room to maneuver. Mitch McConnell was challenged to be the Senate Minority Leader. He won that challenge, but the fact that he did face a challenge was a sign of some dissent within the party. And what's interesting, again, as part of an evolving civil war, is that the guy who challenged him, Rick Scott, has now faced criticism from other Republicans saying they want to do an audit of how he ran the senatorial campaign committee. And so there's clearly a lot of foment there within the Republican Party. On the Democratic side, obviously this was a better night for Democrats than people expected, but the titular head of the party is Joe Biden, who turns 80 this coming Sunday, which means he'll be 82 the next election, or about to turn 82, and would be 86 if he finishes his second term. And so I think there are a lot of people who are very uncomfortable with that, especially if it looks like he's facing someone who is a young and more energetic opponent. And I think it's far from clear how that itself will play out. And then lastly, on the question again of getting back to American leadership and America's role in the world, I think that while Biden has posed himself as more of an internationalist, one of the things that has become interesting in the U.S., and in a lot of ways this was due to President Trump's agenda, is the real hard turn that has become a bipartisan consensus in the United States, both regarding China and regarding trade. Biden has been unable to create any effective trade agenda. There is no sign, despite Japan's strong desire, that the U.S. is going to rejoin TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. They've created this kind of very weak framework as a way of replacing it, but clearly the United States doesn't have any ability to have a positive trade agenda. And in terms of China, Biden in some ways is now, out-trumping Trump in terms of how tough he is, in particular with an announcement last month of stronger export controls and pressure on allies, particularly Japan, to adhere to those export controls. And I think that's going to be a real source of tension between the U.S. and Japan and other allies going forward about how strictly we enforce export controls, particularly on technology to China. And I would just close by noting that, I mean, in terms of America's role in the world, I mean, Biden has an interesting sense of humor and a sense of humility about him. And he said recently, he was asked, he said that when he first went to one of his early summits, the G7, you know, he tried to take to the world this message that America's back. And he said that one of the G7 leaders, he didn't identify which one, looked him in the eye and said, yes, but for how long? And I think that's kind of the question that we're looking at going forward.
Thank you. That is a really great way to move into the next round. So let me start with this theme that you painted about the role of America's role, kind of America's role in the world, but also the state of democracy. And, you know, from the outside of the G7, of which Prime Minister Kishida is going to be hosting next year and gets to set the agenda, you know, the G20, because of what's happening in Ukraine, is not as, you know, relevant anymore. And also, sitting right across the street from the UN, when you have Russia as a veto-carrying member of the Security Council, there's not much that can get done over there. So the G7 becomes even more important for the democracies. And yet, you just painted a pretty dire picture about, you know, Japan. We have a pretty dire picture of the United States as well. And yet, at the same time, there is room for optimism, despite all the things that we just heard. And I think some of the points that, you know, Jake, you just made about, you know, the strength of Ron DeSantis in Florida, the good night that most incumbents had, that Glenn, you were just talking about. What does this mean in terms of the future of kind of U.S. Japan, but more importantly, D.C.'s ability to manage the domestic politics that is tending towards the more isolationist and more internal focus on ourselves, but the need clearly in a world that is in a very difficult place geopolitically, with a war in a pretty unprecedented way with a nuclear-armed, you know, Russia. We saw what happened, you know, yesterday. As Donald Trump is making his announcement, you see these, you know, Russian-made missiles flying into Poland and discussions about that. In such a politically fraught environment where our military leaders are telling us this is the most difficult environment since the Cold War. We just had General Milley here who's talking about how difficult this is going to be for Ukraine moving into the winter. How do we manage that domestic politics and the pull that all of us have to watching the dumpster fire that is the presidential election that we've just kicked off last night, to the importance of keeping the course for the long game, as Mitch McConnell's famous of saying? Let me start there with you, Glenn.
Okay, that is a very good and involved question. Let me try to go at it from the following framework. Let me start with like America's role in the world and where I see us headed, and then I want to talk about some domestic forces that we should look at to kind of help us think about how to analyze this question. So number one, President Biden will now have more attention to spend on the world and global issues. His legislative agenda is honestly largely done. There are some things that didn't get done and some things that, you know, they still want to try to work on. But the big ticket items, you know, COVID recovery, you know, building back better, putting in an infrastructure, bipartisan infrastructure bill through, doing the inflation reduction, investments in climate, energy, other things, those things are finished. And so now with the divided government and there's really not many big ticket legislative items that are going to go through, the president has more attention to put to the world. What are the trends that are going to define the president's attention? You mentioned many of them, but I would say there's one key one that unites both Democrats and Republicans in Washington, largely, and the United States and Japan on the global stage, and that is technological competition with China, right? We have a great deal of alignment with Japan on that question, and many of areas where we face similar challenges, and all the incentive in the world to work together with our key ally in Japan to make headway in terms of our ability to compete with China on the world stage. It's in the president's national security plan that's one of the key things we need to do. And it's also something that brings Republicans and Democrats together on Capitol Hill because they share a sense of urgency around this. Does that mean they're going to just agree on everything and it's going to be easy? No, but there is a unifying force to move us on that issue, I think, in a positive direction. Let me talk a little bit about some domestic political trends in the U.S. that I think we should look at. And I like Jake's idea of taking a step back from the current election and just the sort of who won what race. And let's talk about the lesson and the future of American politics. So there were some really positive aspects of last week's election. The fact that it was largely peaceful was really a sigh of relief for so many of us, because it could have gone a lot worse. That's great. Does that mean that America is entering a golden age of cooperation and calm and, you know, everybody getting together? It does not. Why? We still have a political culture of division in the country. We have an electoral system that incentivizes discord and dysfunction. Is it fixable? Absolutely. Is it starting to happen? Are there innovative changes that are taking place, you know, at the state level that affect federal politics? I think so. I would point you to the example of how Alaska changed their voting system. They implemented a different system. They got rid of partisan primaries, which to my mind is one of the key factors incentivizing discord and dysfunction in Congress. And they have a unified primary. Multiple people go to the general, and then they use a instant runoff or ranked choice voting selection methodology to pick the winner. It incentivizes greater cooperation. It tends to, at least. That's Nevada last week just voted to adopt that system there too. There's some momentum for that. They still have to vote again in 2 years. They have a 2-year cycle to approve to approve measures like that. And you may or may not like that particular methodology, but the point is Americans are very frustrated with the discord, and they are looking for ways to change our system to incentivize a little bit more cooperation. But while that process is taking place, there is a very strong political culture of division in this country. You're going to see it. It's going to start playing itself out next year, early in January. Will it debilitate us? I don't think so, and I hope not, but is it going to be a dramatic show? That, along with the fact that because former President Trump announced which is very early to start the presidential cycle, essentially now the presidential cycle is on, and that always complicates any political question. Nakabayashi sensei raised the point of like the debt ceiling. If they don't raise it in the lame duck session now before the end of the year, it's going to come up next year. Will that be a big problem? I think you need to look at the political culture. How much have we gotten into this sort of presidential debate cycle already? It makes it really hard for the parties to come together. It could be a big problem. It could be a point of stress. But just to come back to, if you ask yourself, are there any unifying issues around which, you know, good faith members on both sides might go in a back room and sit down and say, you know, we got to do something on this? And I think the answer, especially on competition with China, is yes. And I think that will be definitive in our relationship with Japan as well.
Very helpful. So let me just take that to Mieko Sensei in terms of there's a lot to pick up on, but as you look at kind of the same points about America's role, you know, I think the point that Jake just made about it could have very easily been Japanese Prime Minister Kishida says, yeah, but how long? And I heard that skepticism a lot in Japan. And one of the things that was interesting is I think traditionally Japanese have felt more comfortable with Republicans. Mm-hmm. You work for a Republican senator, and you know, in some ways that's the traditional role. But this Republican Party is not something that any Japanese recognizes. And I think particularly without Shinzo Abe on this earth, there is no one in Japan there's no one in the world that can manage a President Trump redo. And so I guess the question is, how are you thinking? How are you advising? And what are the people in Nagatacho, in the political areas of Tokyo, thinking in this way for managing this new version of America 2.0 for the next 2 years of the presidential cycle, but also trying to get things done that's very important to Japan's global agenda as well?
Yes, that's a great point. Who can, well, handle or to deal with President Trump if he is elected? Well, I guess Prime Minister Kishida is not as good at former Prime Minister Abe to communicate with well, potential president again, Trump. Well, but we don't know so far who would become American president in 2024. So we will be watching U.S. politics very, very closely. And as Mr. Nye just pointed out, I have one question. During this lame duck session, is it possible to raise the debt ceiling by any chance?
Yes, it is possible.
Is it?
They could do it if they wanted to.
Oh.
And remember, the current election only determines the makeup of the Congress after January 3rd. So the current Congress is still the same one
Right.
from before election. So it's possible they could do it, but both parties, leadership, especially in the Senate, would have to agree.
That's right. Well, but if it is extended or delayed until next year, I think American market is going to crazy. And the world market is going to crazy. Europe is already in almost recession. And it's going to be a huge impact, I think, in the world economy. And Japanese economy is also suffering from slowing down in China. And Japanese currency almost dumped. And everything is becoming expensive.
But cheaper for the tourists there. So
Right, that's right.
good news for us.
That's the only thing, right. Well, politically, Prime Minister Kishida's good news is he has a golden 3 years. He doesn't have any major national elections for 3 years after he had upper house election this year. Therefore, he can really enjoy his leadership if he wants. And the biggest hurdle is the current scandal and some weakness that he showed how to manage all those crises in political arena. So once he can re-establish confidence among Japanese people, he has a huge advantage of 3 years. Therefore, his maybe first chance would be the G7 summit that he is planning to have in Hiroshima, his own district. But the problem is the Ukraine war and nuclear threat by Russia and now North Korea. Therefore, it is very difficult to declare that Kishida administration is pushing Japan toward non-nuclear nation because Japan is protected by extended deterrence of the United States, a nuclear umbrella. Therefore, well, Prime Minister Kishida has to walk on a very tight rope in terms of Japanese national security. But still, he has an opportunity to show his leadership and his good communication skills with national leaders, of course, including President Biden and other international leaders. Although European politics are getting pretty difficult, British Prime Minister was newly again elected. But President Trump and Prime Minister Kishida have been in international politics for such a long time. Therefore, I think they can show their seniority and consensus making and their skills. Well, I think the United States and Japan should really cooperate very closely in terms of national defense and international trade agreement. As Mr. Schlesinger said, TPP is nothing that the United States can come back, but I'm sure Japan would insist and keep saying that the United States should come back to TPP. I think that is Japanese mission to appeal to the world that the United States still has a role and huge responsibility to lead international, I think, economy. And that is the, I think, option that the Kishida administration has.
Thank you. I'm going to give the last word to Jake, but then I'm coming to all of you. We have a very short period of time, but if you have a specific question, I see some very distinguished people in the audience. I'll try not to call out Okazaki-san of Toyota, who's on the board of directors of Japan Society, or Endo-san from the consulate. So I want to make sure that I give everyone an opportunity. But if you have a question, please catch my eye. So Jake, how do you wrap this in a bow for us as we come out of this to both, you know, kind of keep a broader perspective? And you talked about taking a step back and looking a bigger picture on the camera. You've been covering things for a while, and you've seen a lot of different presidents, and you've seen a lot more prime ministers in Japan come and go. So how do you keep perspective on these things?
I mean, I guess I would say, sort of bringing it back, as you had said at the opening, to what matters for Japan and for the U.S. Japan relationship is that, I mean, in some ways, it's actually a good period. I think the number of areas of tension are probably historically low. The areas of agreement and shared goals are quite high. I think that the weaknesses in America provide an opportunity, in a sense, for Japan to step up and do more. And there's a lot of goodwill for Americans who want that to happen. And I think the question, in some ways, or the challenge for Japan is whether it can. And I think Prime Minister Abe, in so many ways, it was remarkable how much he was able to sort of turn that ship in Japan. And in some ways, it was his agenda. In some ways, it was just his longevity. I remember, I guess he took office not quite 10 years ago. And he wanted to go to Washington as one of his first stops. And President Obama didn't want to meet with him, not because he had any disdain for Japan, because he said, why should I take my time? And I've already had like 5 Japanese prime ministers in my presidency. How long is this guy going to be around? Well, ironically, he was around quite long, and they developed a good relationship and outlasted Obama. But I think it's disturbing in that context what's happened since Prime Minister Abe has left, where you've already now in your second prime minister, and one that, as Mieko has said eloquently, is quite weakened. And so I guess I would say that I think it's a moment of opportunity, but the turmoil in the leadership on both sides also creates a big challenge.
Thank you. Do we have questions? Please, I know that the Americans are very good at putting their hands straight up, but I want to encourage our Japanese friends to do the same. I see a question right up here, please. I think there's a mic right there. Let's keep our questions as short as possible and targeted, but thank you, please.
Would the distinguished panel comment on the meeting between Xi Jinping and Biden?
Okay.
Very curious about your thoughts.
All right, let's take a few questions. We can go around. Other questions? I feel like Okazaki-san, do you have a question from your perspective? I feel like Toyota is one. You have to promote Toyota in terms of the role. They're one of the few Japanese companies that does a very good job of managing government relations.
Thank you, Joshua. Yeah, actually, I wanted to ask Nakabayashi Sensei exactly the same question you just asked. Back in 2017, when Trump administration started, we were so concerned about his anti-trade or anti-globalization or America First policy. But finally, I would say our business was protected by the good relationship between two leaders. So who would play the role Abe-san was playing? That was my question, but that's nobody can answer. Yesterday I was talking to Josh, and he said Japanese too pessimistic about our own country's status of politics and also economic situation. So I was convinced we should be more positive about our own country's economy and politics. So if you have any advice for the Japanese business sectors, how can we become more positive?
That's great. Any last question? I see some younger next generation folks back here. I don't know why you're sitting in the very back, but please, here. Thank you for asking a question right behind Yuka.
Sorry, this might be a bit U.S.-centric, but I was curious if you had any key takeaways on what happened in New York this midterm cycle.
Very interesting. Should we go in reverse order? Is that fair? Jake, we'll go this way and end with Glenn?
Yeah, actually, I mean, I think that's actually a great question about the Biden-Xi summit. And look, I mean, any one summit doesn't change things that much, but I think it was important to lower the temperature. There was a lot of positive rhetoric. I mean, it's clear that there are still big differences, but at least they're talking again, which they hadn't done for a while. And I would just actually add to that to say I think there's a lot of positive diplomacy in the region this past week. I mean, actually, Prime Minister Kishida is supposed to meet with President Xi tomorrow, or maybe it's today, our time, but he's meeting with him soon. And also importantly, as you probably noticed, I mean, the Prime Minister Kishida met with South Korean President Yoon, and then there was a trilateral meeting with President Biden as well, and they issued their first ever trilateral communique. And so there are positive signs of diplomacy that are going on, but again, we have to see whether that translates into specific action.
Please.
Thank you so much for the question. I'm asked that exact question so many times, even in Japan. And some people say that maybe Mr. Aso, former Prime Minister, would be a good person to succeed former Prime Minister Abe's position to communicate with someone like Mr. Trump. Well, but Mr. Aso is not really kind of person who can appease someone like Mr. Abe did. So maybe we have to search for someone before 2014 presidential election. Of course, there are politicians who can speak English very well and good at playing golf, and so on and so forth. So I think there are some hopes about that if we find carefully. But the problem is Japanese domestic politics, whether we can elect someone like that and put them in senior positions or not. I guess bureaucrats cannot replace politicians for that kind of position to deal with the American president. As you mentioned, Japanese people are so pessimistic. It is incredible. When we had a close meeting with leaders of American Chamber of Commerce and Japanese business leaders last week or so, American person in Japan were very positive and listing all sorts of good things and strengths of Japanese companies, technology, culture, and everything. However, all Japanese participants were so pessimistic. Japanese society is aging too much, and we cannot really reform Japan. Japanese political leaders are all, well, incapable of doing anything, and so on and so forth. But I agreed with the American participant, and I think Japan has so many strengths. Therefore, regardless Japanese politics, I think Toyota and other great corporations are having offices and factories in the United States. I think they are the leading, force to come up with great U.S.-Japan relations. So I am very optimistic about that. Thank you so much.
Let me start with the question about New York politics, and I'm not sure if there's a particular race that you wanted to comment on, but I'll give you a few thoughts, and hopefully I'll hit the mark for you. So we talked about this cycle. Democrats had won a lot of close races that we hadn't necessarily predicted they would win, but they didn't win all of them. And one of those factors in those very, very, very close races was the issue of the Dobbs decision, but it played a lot smaller role in states that have Democratic legislatures where voters just weren't as concerned that the law was going to change. It just didn't drive as much additional turnout and registration. So what happens in New York, you saw like really high-profile loss of Sean Patrick Maloney, who's the DCCC chair, in a race just north of New York City. Again, one of those really close races, it just went the other way because of all those factors in this cycle that were working for Republicans or for change. There were a lot more competitive races in New York than the Democrats would have wished. Democratic Party in New York tried to draw a map that was much more satisfying for the Democrats and helpful for them. But the state court struck it down. It was actually quite an awful gerrymander from my perspective. It was one of those ones I put up as almost as bad as places like Florida. So, but the court reversed it, and the map actually was a lot less Democratic leaning than they would have liked. And so we saw in the redistricting cycle several Democrats drawn together. So one's eliminated, and a lot of kind of Democratic infighting. So I hope I answered your question. I do want to touch quickly on the question about business that the gentleman from Toyota asked. And here's something I think, an observation and kind of maybe a prediction. I do think that this technological competition with China, which I mentioned, will drive some of these decisions, blends a national security and an economic question. you see right now the Biden administration putting emphasis on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework as the thing they're doing to try to craft the economics of the region to bring potential partners closer to the U.S. marketplace. Japan is an absolutely important partner and ally in the effort if that is going to turn into something useful. I know we've all sort of talked about how TPP's like off the table for right now, but I don't think trade, traditional kind of trade or market access questions are permanently off the table. I think it will depend on how the competition with China goes. I do think you may see in the coming year Democrats and Republicans competing with each other to be tough on China. That might mean a few more visits to Taiwan. I don't know, but I'm just saying it could be. Tensions could rise. It may be that IPEF is able to come together and coalesce around some useful things, but without the market access, there's just kind of a limit there, but might set the stage for future discussions on market access. Particularly, I think, if there's a second Biden administration, maybe in that second administration, there's room to talk about some of these things. Why? Because of the national security side of that question. What you need to do in the national security context is less tariffing of your allies and friends and more organizing around this competition. That may mean actually reduction of some tariffs strategically with allies that we need to work closely with. It may mean electric vehicle, a little more access. It just may mean rationalizing production of core minerals and where they're refined. But we're going to have to think about the national security part of that strategy in addition to just the simple economic part of it. And I do think there might be a door opening in the future that could be beneficial for some of our Asian trading partners.
Well, I think the good news is we could probably sit here all night and continue this conversation because this has been such an engaging one. And thank you for the great questions from the floor. I apologize for failing as a moderator to get us out exactly on time. But the good news is that the fun can continue, and you can continue asking those questions if you'll join us in a reception right outside where you can have some good food as well, because I think we've set the table very well, figuratively speaking. But the good news, what I hear from it, what all of you have said is this is a to-be-continued conversation, and that the continued importance of the U.S. Japan relationship at all levels, not just between president and prime minister or Diet and Congress, mayor, city to city, state to state, business to business, society to society, and that's what Japan society is all about. And I think that mission of connecting the U.S. and Japan across the people and the cultures and societies is exactly why we appreciate all of you being here tonight. So thank you. Will you please join me in thanking our excellent panel and join us for a reception right outside.